Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Benam Farbad. This is my YouTube channel. I'm using it to produce videos for different reasons, but today the presentation I'm about to give you guys is part of my studies at Moravian College in a class for my Political Science 225 called Congress and the Presidency. For this presentation, I'll be discussing President Obama and his Iran nuclear deal, better known as the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehension Plan of Action. I'll first give you an intro about President Obama, and then we'll talk more about the deal itself, its significance, legacy, public opinion, and relationship to Congress. So first I want to cover why am I covering this? Why does it matter? So it's still relevant today. Obama moved to create it in tandem with the P5+1, so 6 nations, so France, UK, China, Russia, Germany, and the United States, alongside with obviously Iran. So he moved to create it. They made it created it together, and it was signed off in 2015. But President Trump in 2018 unilaterally left the deal, meaning he took the U.S. out of the deal on his own. Everyone else tried to stay in it. Now, with President Biden in office, he has to decide and navigate the future of that deal. Will he rejoin it? Will he try and renegotiate it? So we'll have to see. Now for Obama. So Obama, as most of you should know, was the 44th president of the United States, serving in that capacity from 2009 to 2017. He signed the deal in 2015. He was a member of the Democratic Party. He's the first African American president, and before being president, he was a senator of Illinois from 2005 to 2008, and a state senator inside Illinois from 1997 to 2004. His legacy, well, as you guys probably know, a lot of his domestic stuff included Obamacare. He brought us out of the recession caused by the financial crisis before his presidency, but he had a lot to do with foreign policy as well. His first term, you could argue, was a lot more maybe aggressive foreign policy-wise. He started military actions in Libya, military actions in Syria. He increased troop deployments to Afghanistan. His drone warfare was really heavy. But his second term was a lot different, and maybe that's because he learned from mistakes or didn't want to make the same mistakes. His second term was a lot more stable, I would argue. He pulled out of Iraq, but then he had to come back in because of ISIS. He pulled troops out of Afghanistan. He didn't commit to more actions such as Libya and Syria. And he moved to make this Iran nuclear deal, though he tried in his first term as well, but we'll get onto that. And another thing he did in his second term was he reopened relationships with Cuba. So Cuba and Iran were two nations historically that U.S. considered enemies, and he made pass in his second term to open up relations with both of them. So his second term was really, in terms of foreign policy, big on his legacy, I think. And as I said, he left office in 2017. And when he left office, he had an approval rating of 60%. So he was very popular when he left. Now for context and background on the nuclear deal itself. So its origins, it goes back all the way to the before the 1970s. So Iran's nuclear program actually began at the behest of the United States. Pre-1979, before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Iran was an ally of the United States, and it was viewed by the U.S. in the Cold War as a bulwark against communism, against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. Think of it as a combination of Israel and Saudi Arabia today militarily. It was there as America's chief ally, chief military resource. We didn't have as many bases there yet, so the nuclear program started there. But in 1979, after the revolution and the U.S. hostage crisis, the relationship was opposite. So now those few facilities the U.S. helped Iran make were under the control of a government that U.S. viewed as hostile, and that U.S. was also hostile to as well. So in response to that, there was first sanctions that slowly increased over the years, and in the 1990s, the United States decided to label Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, which meant more sanctions, more arms embargoes, etc. We could cover the presidencies that were before the year 2000, but I'm going to focus on the Bush presidency, Obama, and then Trump on this regarding terms of context. So the Bush presidency, Bush was very much against negotiation. He was surrounded by war hawks who wanted to go into Iran after Iraq. Iran was labeled as the axis of evil under his administration. So that was North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Iran. And we went into Iraq shortly after Afghanistan, but because of our trouble there, Bush never had a chance to really do anything in Iran. And at the same time, Bush was against negotiation. Iran had a regime under their president Khatami who was actually pro negotiation. So it was it was the opposite dichotomy. But it's important to know that during Bush's presidency, intelligence reports by the U.S. and world intelligence agencies stated that Iran was not actively trying to create a weaponized program, and as of 2003 had seemed to completely stop their any type of program that would weaponize their nuclear capabilities. Then during Obama's first presidency, as I said, he was open to diplomacy with Iran, but his presidency election was around the same time as Iran's hardliner President Ahmadinejad was elected. So now America was open to negotiation, and Iran had a hardliner very similar to President Trump's hardline stances foreign policy. Iran had one. In this case, Iran was a lot more belligerent in the region, but intelligence reports still stated that Iran was not actively choosing to weaponize the program, but they were keeping the option there. So this kind of goes towards what was called the breakout time. So basically, by President Obama's second term, Iran, according to intelligence reports, had the ability, if it chose to, that's important, chose to weaponize their current materials they had within 2 to 3 months. And we'll talk about that more. Other context was Israel. And I'd say context for Israel because before Obama's nuclear deal, there was a very good chance we were going to go to war with Iran. Tensions were high, or maybe not full-out war, but at least, bombing campaigns, whatnot. Israel was assassinating Iranian scientists left and right. It was a very big deal. Each time, would Iran respond? Who knows? Iran had lots of proxies in Iraq after the war there. Europeans, on the opposite hand, Europeans wanted very much so to get into a negotiation with Iran. They had a lot of economic interests in Iran, and they also were tired of the instability. Finally, in Obama's second term, President Rouhani, a reformist and a moderate, was elected to Iran's government. And now, for the first time in a long time, both Iran and America had presidents who wanted to negotiate. So now we'll talk about the actual nuclear deal. So as I said, Iran and the 6 world powers, known as the P5+1, which were China, France, Germany, Russia, UK, and US, reached this deal in 2015. It was about mid-2015. It was, I want to say July. Yeah, July 2015. And it limited Iran's nuclear abilities, limited their nuclear program, and very much so enhanced monitoring of the program in exchange for relief in terms of nuclear sanctions. So the deal would be that Iran would be less sanctioned, more access to the world economy, the U.S. economy, and in return they would very much so limit their program, destroy much of their program, and agree to monitoring. And I'll go into much more depth on that in a few seconds. As I said, prior to the deal, Iran had become and was suspected of engaging in efforts to acquire or have the ability, if it wanted to build nuclear weapons for at least the last 2 decades. And Obama's intelligence community, though certain that Iran was not actively taking those steps, was uncertain whether Iran would choose to in the future to build those weapons, because at the same time that it seemed they weren't weaponizing, they did seem to have the technology build up. Their technology was really improving. That included their missile capabilities, their warhead capabilities. Their uranium was increasingly being more enriched, which was, I think at the time, above 4%. And if you get to 90-some%, you can now weaponize it. At the same time, Iran also had enough plutonium and a heavy water plant that would create plutonium, which is the actual fissile material to create a bomb. So Iran had the material, and if they wanted, could enrich to higher qualities. But of course, once you get that noticed, someone might bomb you, such as the America. So the intelligence was uncertain would Iran make that choice, and that was one of the reasons tensions were high. So even though Iran maintained that its nuclear activities were entirely peaceful, the Obama presidency continued to be suspicious, and that was the driver in his wanting to get negotiations, whereas President Bush and later President Trump were much more military action oriented to get their foreign policy decisions made. President Obama was more geared towards diplomacy, at least in his second term as presidency. So he favored diplomacy over military action to thwart Iran. And with President Rouhani there, as I said, finally they were able to negotiate. So the actual deal had several facets to it. So first was that enriched uranium that Iran had. Enriched uranium, it can be used to create reactor fuel, which can be made to create nuclear weapons. At the time, as I said, Iran had 3 to 4% in their enriched uranium, but above 90% to create a bomb. In 2015, Iran had roughly 20,000 centrifuges, which is what is used to create and enrich uranium. But under the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, Iran was limited to roughly just 5,000, and that 5,000 was basically the oldest and least efficient centrifuges they had, and that was going to be the case until 2026, basically a 10-year implementation, and that was basically meant that to basically keep their nuclear reactor functioning so it wouldn't blow up. So nothing more than the minimum allowed. And their current uranium stockpiles were reduced by over 98%, and they were not allowed to increase it beyond the 2% they maintained until 2031. 2031. And that enrichment level could not exceed 3.67%. And the reason they chose that percent was because that would allow them to create medical treatments to be used on illnesses such as cancer and whatnot. So they decided to agree to that level and not go further. Then there was the idea of those major facilities Iran had created or the U.S. had created in the 70s. And there were 3 major facilities before the nuclear deal functioning. There was the Arak facility, the Fordow facility, and Natanz. The Arak facility was a heavy water plant, and that heavy water could be used to create plutonium, which would then be used in the fissile material of a nuclear bomb. The Arak heavy water plant was now redesigned under the nuclear deal, and it physically was after the deal was signed, mainly with cement to block off the sections that were being used to create that plutonium. So this basically made it that Iran could not weaponize, create the material meant to put into their warheads if they weaponized the uranium. And this policy of no heavy water plants was to be put in place until 2031. And let's say Iran chose in 2031 to create one, it would take many, many years to actually build the facility. So this was basically a policy of the U.S., and this will become a theme of this decade or two spanning reach where Iran would be welcomed back with these, monitoring into the global community, and the hope was that they would choose to stay in that and wouldn't go out of it. And if they did, then it would simply be a return to tensions, maybe renegotiate a deal. But Obama and the negotiators were banking on Iran choosing to stay in the how would you say it, spirit of the deal even after the deal ended in around 2 decades or so. Now, the Fordow facility was designed to be an enrichment center alongside the Natanz facility. So those two were where they enriched uranium. The Fordow one was completely redesigned and dismantled to become a normal tech center until at least 2031. So that wiped out one of Iran's 2 nuclear facilities. So that only left Iran with 1 nuclear facility, that being the Natanz facility, and that was the only one in the entire nation. And it was to be completely 24/7 monitored by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, meaning Iran would not be able to enrich their uranium beyond that 3.67% anywhere in the nation, because that was their only location that they had it. Even further, the IAEA was allowed to go anywhere in the nation. They were allowed to send observers anywhere in the nation if they suspected Iran was trying to build secret locations, etc., which is already a hard thing to do because it would take lots of time and resources. But the IAEA can now look for that. So it made it very easy with only one facility existing and free access anywhere they wanted to monitor Iran and make sure they didn't break the deal. Until 2031, Iran had, if they failed any of the IAEA's demands, the signatory nations of the deal, within 24 days, if Iran did not comply within 24 days, could reinstate their sanctions. So there was an incentive there for Iran to stick to the deal. So if Iran left the deal, started, weaponizing the program or enriching, they could get sanctioned again. And that ended up happening about a year after Trump left the deal. And Iran agreed to continue the existing arms embargo for another 5 years. So they signed this deal, and they agreed to still not be allowed to buy weapons from the world powers. Now today they still can, because it's been more than 5 years. Iran, in return for signing this deal, got sanctions relief. So a lot of their sanctions ended. A lot of Europeans and American businesses came into the country. The economy grew by about 10% the first year after the deal, and Iran got access to about $100 billion of their own money that had been frozen due to sanctions that were stuck in the world banks and world markets. Now, what was the significance of this? Was Obama right? I would argue that Obama entered into his presidency with high tensions with Iran that were only increasing. By the day, it seemed more and more likely like Israel would bomb one of these Iranian facilities, and Iran could retaliate, and that could draw America into a war. And as I said before, the intelligence was uncertain would Iran rush for the bomb. But they knew that if Iran did rush and wasn't caught by America, within a few months they could possibly create at least one bomb. And it was believed that they had the ability, if given even more time, to create 8 to 10 bombs. So Obama's chief goal was to present a nuclear bomb. He didn't focus on any other relations with Iran in terms of, their militias, proxy wars, missile capabilities. He focused singularly on nuclear bombs, and that was important because that became a point of focus for the Republican Party and opponents of the deal to focus on later. And after this deal was not possible, the IAEA stated that Iran had shown since 2003 that it was not actively trying to weaponize. So that was another reason Obama decided to go through with this. Now, how about the legacy? So the legacy, well, it was basically destroyed as of now, but we'll see if Biden will come back into it. And it was destroyed because of President Trump's decisions. He unilaterally left the deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions tougher than ever before on Iran and anyone and any company that would trade with Iran. And this made it really tough for Europeans to stick to the deal, and they really tried to. And this really hurt America's reputation abroad because we unilaterally left a deal signed by the world's major powers as well as Iran. So it hurt our reputation, and it really hurt a lot of the Iranian enthusiasm for the deal, and I'll get that to later. So when Trump left, one of the major problems with that, according to his opponents and world powers, was that he had no evidence that Iran was not abiding by the deal. By all evidence, Iran was completely complying, and it was working. The tensions were lower. There was no chance of Iran rushing a bomb because they were under maintenance and they didn't have the material anymore. And the only nations that supported President Trump in this action were both Israel and Saudi Arabia, and both of them failed to provide evidence that Iran was breaking the deal as well. Why didn't Trump like it? Well, he didn't like the timeline. He didn't like that after 10, 15, 20 years on certain aspects, Iran could, if they wanted to, revamp their nuclear program. And it's important to remember, by revamping doesn't mean weaponizing. Many countries have nuclear programs that are civilian, so Japan, Sweden, France, etc. But he was very suspicious of it. He also didn't like that it only focused on nuclear capabilities, whereas Obama, in order to get the deal, because his main priority were those nuclear capabilities, he focused only on those. Trump wanted that to focus on missile technology, proxies, militias, etc. Basically, Iran's entire foreign policy. In order for Trump to play friendly with Iran, he wanted Iran, in a large part, to completely reform its foreign policy and state. And it also happened because Trump, through myriad of reasons, fired his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and his National Security Advisor, McMaster, both of whom wanted America to stay in the nuclear deal. And their replacements, Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, both were long opposed to the deal. They were known as Iran hawks, and they were often saying pro-action in Iran. And that came into focus later on, when we almost went to war with Iran, Trump was actually the one who said, let's not do it, whereas his advisors really wanted that military action. How was he able to leave? So a lot of people thought that he was able to leave because it was not a Senate-confirmed treaty. It was an executive agreement signed by Obama with foreign leaders. And just so you understand, and we've talked about this a little bit in class, the president has the ability to conduct diplomacy with foreign nations. And between 1977 and 1996, presidents negotiated nearly 4,000 executive agreements with foreign countries, but only 300 Senate-approved confirmed treaties. So there was a lot more executive agreements than confirmed treaties. Had it been a Senate-confirmed treaty, would he have been able to leave? Basically, yes, he still would have been able to leave. So he would not have, having it a signed treaty would not have changed anything. A couple examples. In 1978, President Carter withdrew from the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. That had been a Senate-ratified treaty. And more recently, President Bush Jr. did the same in 2001 when he informed President Putin of Russia, the same Putin, that the United States would withdraw from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In both cases, there was very little congressional opposition, though the in Carter's case, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona did oppose it, and he tried to get it brought to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear it. So, and they deemed it a political issue, not a constitutional issue, which seems to show that Congress has not opposed too much, and the Supreme Court has basically left this to the president's digression. So those who say Obama's mistake was not getting it Senate ratified, and he was at fault, are wrong. And realistically, there was no chance of him getting it ratified in Senate. The Republican Party was very much against the Iran nuclear deal, and they controlled both the Senate and Congress. Now, what happened after Trump left the deal? About a year after he left, in that first year, Iran really tried to maintain the deal. They actually adhered to it, even though Iran left, and their hopes were that the Europeans would still provide the established benefits that were expected in the deal, conduct trade, access to their market, etc. But that very clearly and very quickly became untenable because the U.S. started sanctioning any company doing business with Iran. For example, Airbus, a European airplane manufacturer, had agreed before Trump left the deal to create and sell to Iran a lot of their planes. But after Trump left, they were forced to leave in fear of sanctions. And Iran's economy really depreciated because of these sanctions. Inflation quadrupled, their currency became basically meaningless, and trade with foreign nations dropped a lot, and they couldn't sell their oil. After that first year of Iran trying to stay to the deal, maintaining their side of it, they began to become more belligerent and slowly leave the deal as a means of showing. Basically they thought that why should we stick to it if the rest of the world isn't doing what they agreed to. And slowly but surely, they left the deal. They started revamping their enrichment, building more centrifuges again, and a Cold War basically started in the Middle East. For example, oil shipments were being raided, bombed. Saudi Arabia's biggest oil plant was bombed. Israel was bombing Iranian forces in Syria. The IAEA had lost access. And then finally, the President Trump had assassinated a military commander of Iran, and we almost went to war, where Iran responded with a missile attack on an American base. But luckily, they warned us beforehand, letting our soldiers get into the shelters. It was kind of like a symbolic missile attack. But had an American soldier been killed and they not warned us, it's very likely we would have gone to war. And these fears grew mainly because we had left the deal. Now, with Biden as president, and I believe Iran didn't go further with their responses because they were hoping Trump wouldn't win the second election. But with Biden president, Biden promised during the elections that he would have no more nonsense in the Middle East, and he would go back to the negotiating table with Iran. But Iran wants all those sanctions Trump imposed after the deal had been originally signed to come back before they go back to the deal. In their eyes, America left first, then Iran left, so America should come back first, and Iran will come back. But Biden wants the opposite. Biden wants them to go back to the deal, get rid of those centrifuges, go back to stopping their enrichment levels, in order for him to get rid of the sanctions. So it's kind of like a deadlock. And last week, President Biden actually bombed Iranian military forces supporting the Syrian government, and now we have high tensions again. So it's unclear where we're going to go with this. Lastly, I'd like to talk about public opinion. So when Obama signed the deal, it was actually very controversial. The Republican side of Congress was very much against the deal, and the public wasn't sure. According to a poll by the Pew Research Center in 2015, right when Obama got us in the deal, 33% were approving of the deal, 45% of Americans were against it, and 22% were unsure. So it was very controversial. But under Trump, as the years went by and tensions grew, public opinion became much more supportive of the nuclear deal. In mid-2018, right about when Donald Trump left the treaty, a poll, again by the Pew Research Center, found that 53% of Americans, of the general public, and 94% of scholars of international relations in the U.S. disapproved of Trump's decision to withdraw from the treaty. So you see that it went from a 33 public opinion approval rating of the deal to a 53%. That's a very large gain over just 3 years. In Iran, public opinion had been very much so in support of the deal. When it was signed, 76% of the Iranians were in support of the deal because they wanted to rejoin the world community. But today, in 2019, only 42% of Iranians support rejoining the deal. And that's mainly because they were disappointed in Europe and in the U.S. because the promises that were made in signing the deal were not delivered. So to them, their opinion is now, why should we rejoin? You didn't listen. You didn't adhere to it the first time. Why should we have faith for you? And that could possibly prove very powerful for the future. In an upcoming election, maybe President Rouhani, a moderate and a reformist, loses an election, and let's say a hardliner gets elected again. Then we're going to see lots of problems in the region. Imagine a Trump presidency where instead of the other side was a moderate who was pro-negotiation, there had been another hardliner, 2 hardliners on each side. Who knows what that would become? So it's very important. We're going to be very important to see what President Biden does. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you all have a nice day.